Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Austin Hay. He is the head of marketing technology at Ramp, which is a corporate finance platform that supports over 15,000 businesses. Previously, he was VP of business operations at Runway, and before that, VP of growth at Imparticle. And then before that, even the fourth employee at Unicorn Branch Metrics. Austin, super excited to have you on the show today. You've got quite the track record over the last 10 years in the MarTech space. So maybe to kick things off, give a quick intro. How did you get introduced to the data world and how did you end up at Ramp?
How did I get started in MarTech and how did I land at Ramp? Those are some good questions. So I would say like all of my career kind of leads back to Branch. Branch is an attribution and deep linking technology that was founded in I think 2015, 2014. I was the fourth employee there. And I, like many kind of early operators at startups, I got the privilege of kind of getting my hands dirty in lots of different domains. Worked on sales with our COO, Mike Molyneux, worked on marketing with our CMO at the time, Mata Sageti, and just had like a blast learning against the different disciplines of marketing and sales and go-to-market more generally. The thing that I fell in love with, though, was the opportunity to help marketers understand and use technology. I had been a self-trained programmer, and I got the opportunity to kind of put that skill to good use, helping marketers understand how to use our SDK and leverage it at the time for these things called attribution and deep linking. But what I really found was that expanded much more broadly beyond those two discrete disciplines. So I left Branch after a couple years and I created my own consulting agency. I've had the honor of consulting and advising a lot of incredible startups and pretty large enterprises. Worked with Walmart, Airbnb, Postmates, Foursquare, Peet's Coffee, JP Morgan Chase. Most recently have gotten to work with Robinhood and Michaels and Sonos. And I've had a lot of experience working with a wide variety of companies, and kind of in the background of all that, I've kind of pursued a career at the intersection of both technology and finance. And so most recently, I joined Runway, which is a small A16Z backed company led by Siki Chen, and we're trying to reinvent the FP&A space. And then I came to Ramp through a little bit more of a personal story. When I was at Runway, I was kind of our owner administrator for Ramp at the time. We used Ramp internally at Runway. And I met Jeff Charles, who was the VP of product at Ramp, and fell in love with both the product, but also the solution space and his view of the world. And so when the time came for me to consider what was next, I just thought Ramp is kind of the best place to go. And at the same time, too, I was working kind of adjacent to marketing technology, and I really wanted to find my way back there. And so that's where the heart led.
And it sounds like you've basically covered about every industry at this point across B2C and B2B. So I'm assuming you've seen a lot of trends and evolution take place. What are some of the biggest changes you've witnessed?
I think over the last 10 years, I've seen startups, medium-sized companies, large enterprises, scaling enterprises, IPO and post-IPO bound companies, both across B2C and B2B. And I focused like largely in this intersection of marketing, data, and product. And one of the first observations is that, all the tools that were young, scrappy startups are now big name companies that almost everybody uses or considers using. I remember we were one of the first customers of Outreach at Branch in 2015. And, it's hard to imagine thinking about Outreach as a small startup anymore. And so what I'm really saying, though, is like, all these tools have matured and become more complex. There's also a lot of new tools. So the diversification of tools has expanded. And it used to be that you could be an expert in everything. And what I've really found, and what defines a lot of good marketing technology practitioners and even data technology practitioners, is not being an expert in everything, but being able to quickly become an expert. Just because you're never really going to know every single tool out there, but knowing the broad categories and being able to figure out how things work and how they fit together into a cohesive system, that's really, I think, a great unlock for people who are early in their careers and maybe thinking about the space. Some other key themes that are like pretty real. Vendor lock-in is very real. So the tools that you choose early on in your company's lifecycle matter, especially as you scale. It becomes increasingly challenging to remove them. Good salesmanship can be just as powerful as product development. See a lot of tools out there, especially I think actually in the CDP space, that are great salesmen, great sales tools. And they don't actually solve the discrete pains maybe in the most elegant ways. And so I think there's a lot of buyer beware that people should be cognizant of. And then the last one, which is maybe representative of the technology industry as a whole, is like things are very cyclical by nature. And so, in particular, you tend to see with marketing tools and data tools, in the beginning, there's always a village mindset. People are really rallying around tools together to help solve problems. Companies haven't quite found product market fit, so they're not really focused as much on some of these problems that we talked about. But then you hit some type of scarcity or plateau where it's a village doesn't work anymore. The one data engineer or growth engineer that you hired to set up all your tools and help you hit the ground running isn't enough. So you have to hire people. You hire experts, head of RevOps, marketing technologists, etc. And you eventually get to this place where now you can build and buy and make those conscious decisions. And then you kind of repeat the cycle again. Once a lot of those people have left the organization, you've matured even further, and you find yourself kind of representing a legacy org where the tools and technology that you put in after scarcity have now been outdated, and maybe you haven't kept up with it. And that cycle of kind of like fast growth and then stagnation, you've seen that across like almost every company I've worked with over time.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Especially too, like with all of this proliferation of tools across the data and MarTech space, it's like every data tool is a MarTech tool and every MarTech tool is a data tool. How do you navigate when you consult and talk to other organizations? Where should they specifically focus their efforts for tools that are going to drive outcomes at the end of the day?
I mean, I would say that most of the time people are just buying tools to solve problems. And so, typically what happens in a small startup or a small company environment, they might go out to procure a tool because they have a discrete problem. Maybe they never thought about tracking users before because they only had alpha customers. And so why are you going to track the intentions of your alpha customers using event tracking if you can just talk to your customer? But as soon as you graduate from 10 customers to 20 to 30 customers, you have to start thinking about doing things at scale because intention, you can't track anymore through conversation alone. And that's just representative of how like most companies go and buy tools is typically there's a pain or a problem, and that's what drives the decision maker to do it. In the early formation of a company's lifecycle, it's often like the co-founder or the early team that experiences these problems. Over time, though, that pain can then be experienced by much broader teams and organizations. So I think it actually just happens organically. In terms of like how people should think about good tools and bad tools, that's a loaded question because I think people don't like intentionally try to buy bad tools per se. It's just that, one, the approach to buying tools is not standardized. Oftentimes you have people who have no experience buying tools, buying really important non-reversible decision tools that they have to buy. And then oftentimes you have really well-versed people who've done lots of buy considerations, but are maybe just like not aware of their bias towards particular tools that make it easy for them. And I'm also not saying that either of those approaches is a bad thing. I think if people want to do better, though, they have to be reflective and cognizant of how those things actually shape their decision making.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you've had the luxury working with marketing technology, I guess, working cross-functionally with both teams, data and the marketing org. What are some of the biggest challenges you see between those teams today?
I think marketing technology today and data infrastructure today is inherently intertwined. You can't have a strong marketing technology team without a strong data core. You can't have a good marketing outcome for your marketing team without the data team either leaning in or having a representative body like marketing technology to support them. So I really think like success today is dependent on cross-functional teams working together and having great alignment from the executive level all the way down. At Ramp, we actually do a really good job of it, I think. And that's to the credit of our data leader, Ian McComber. He staffed multiple engineering resources to work with and directly support the marketing technology team and other teams in the organization. Now, of course, we have the luxury because we're well funded and well resourced. Not everybody has that opportunity, but I do think like if you're going to go to the effort of questioning, do we need a marketing technology team? You should also be asking the question, how is this team going to be supported by data infrastructure team? And I would say like Ian and I, we don't really have challenges working together because we are fairly aligned both in our approach to solving problems and in the tools that we choose and how we manage them. We're both kind of engineers, so we speak largely the same language and we understand concepts in the same plane. But maybe a good example of where confusion can come up is you have infrastructure that moves data around, and obviously marketing technology's job is to move data in service to marketing. The data team job is often to consume that exhaust from engineers and other people and make it readable to the organization. But they also are the controllers of those data pipelines, especially if you use a tool like Hightouch where you can move data from the warehouse upstream back to your ad networks or other places like that. And so there's this problem, which is like marketing needs to move data. Data kind of controls where that data moves, who is the interfacing layer between those two? And that's often the role for a marketing technologist. Now, the example I was going to point to, which I think is actually pretty common for a lot of people, is like, now that integrations are kind of table stakes for a lot of data tools out there, what is the right way to move data from your warehouse or somewhere else to an upstream tool? As a great example, you can move data from Hightouch to a vendor. If you used a tool like Amplitude, they have their own integrations. If you use a email provider like Braze, they have their own set of integrations. So what you're seeing is like there are often many ways to move data depending on your use case and the stack that you have. And there's this question of what is best, what is right. And there's not always a clear answer to that. And so that's an example of where there's a challenge in the sense of like the data team and the marketing technology team need to come up with a process, a procedure, or a philosophy to guide that decision, because there's not just one right answer. There could be multiple answers depending on the context.
And I think some of that probably comes down to the scale at which you need it. If you just need to send data to maybe one destination, maybe the first party integration that they offer is enough. But if you're trying to power, 10 to 20 destinations and across like ad platforms and lifecycle marketing tools, setting up that integration within each of those tools kind of becomes a single point of failure for all of them.
Yeah. Another one too is like if you have two abilities to send data that's roughly the same, one integration doesn't exist with one tool, but another does, but all your integrations are centralized. Then like, do you wait for the vendor to build the integration for you, or do you just use the one out of box as kind of an ad hoc approach, even though all your strategy is kind of normally aligned? And so that's a tough business decision, right? Because you may have to sacrifice something. You either have to sacrifice breaking your strategy or sacrifice waiting so you can comply with your strategy.
And I think one of the biggest trends that's emerged right now to kind of combat this problem is this whole definition of the composable CDP, which is activating all of the existing data and data models, first-party attributes that you have in your warehouse. Since you actually come from the CDP space working at Imparticle before, how do you differentiate between a traditional CDP and a composable CDP? What are some of the benefits and flaws of each approach that you see today?
So first, I think like I'll define CDP. In my head, I think about a CDP as a collection of capabilities. If you go back in time and rewind to 2017, 2016, you got to ask the question, like, what did a CDP originally do? It did three things. It allowed you to collect user data and event data. Almost all original CDPs were based on a two-model system. They had users and events. Some CDPs upgraded to have a third object model called the group or the account, and that was largely to support B2B integrations. But they all started with a very simple and inflexible data model. The second kind of capability of an original CDP was the capacity to create audiences using the data that you collected from users and events, along with the wrench data that came from the warehouse. But at the time, in 2016 and 2017, that required a heavy lift from engineering to do it. You'd maybe have to set up a Python script to send server data from your warehouse in real time into the CDP. And that had a whole host of implications, like what happens if the data is wrong? What happens if that pipeline breaks? What happens if you're sending data into the warehouse and then your storage fees go up? So there was a lot of problems with that. And the third capability is to federate data to a variety of destinations. So those are the three: collect data, create audiences, federate data. So what's happened since then? In my opinion, lots of tools that weren't CDPs in name are now acting like CDPs. And that's creating a lot of confusion in the market. So I call tools CDP-like or CDP adjacent because they can do things that traditional CDPs claim to do. They're still the traditional CDP. There's still tools like Segment out there. But, I've heard, in conversation with people, like people will say Braze is their CDP, right? Because in essence, it's doing the things a CDP should do. It's collecting data. They have the ability to create segments and cohorts. They have integrations to federate that data to other tools and vendors. So they are a CDP, whether they like to claim it or not. The other thing that's happened is a couple of these elements have become commoditized. So first, that data federation has totally become commoditized. Like lots of tools now can send data and receive data. And there's also a whole category of tools that can send data in ad hoc ways, like iPaaS tools. And so I don't think that the whole value prop of integrations is really as strong anymore for the CDP market. Second thing is audiences have also become commoditized. A great example of this, I remember even back in 2018, was AppsFlyer, which was an attribution and deep linking tool, created their own audience capability. They were one of the first ones I would say to become CDP-like, because even AppsFlyer has a two model system, users and events, and you can collect events and then you can create audiences out of that and send it to a destination. They have, a data locker warehouse integration. They have a bunch of destinations to send data to ad networks. It wasn't hard for them to add a couple more on. So, what this leads to is that the only thing that hasn't been commoditized, and I think is a big differentiator between traditional CDPs and composable CDPs, is that you have to either have existing infrastructure or use infrastructure to collect users and events. That still is the way that most marketing tools operate. And existing reverse ETLs don't yet have that capability. And so as long as reverse ETLs don't have the capability to collect, traditional event and user data, then I think CDPs as they currently stand will remain an important part of the conversation. But what I think obviously is happening is traditional CDPs are looking at reverse ETLs and the composable space and saying, hey, that's a great idea. Why don't we have data in the warehouse and make that accessible? And so they're building reverse ETL type capabilities. I mean, we saw this with Segment's recent announcement. And at the same time, I think reverse ETLs, that they're smart, are saying to themselves, hey, actually, we do everything that a composable CDP should do. Why don't we just build that infrastructure layer so people can actually get the best of both worlds? They can collect all their data in real time, store it in the warehouse, make manipulation in the warehouse. The big thing I would say, though, is some of the limitations, I would say, to traditional CDPs, I'm not sure if they're surmountable. The two that come to mind are, one, this object model limitation is really big. The nice thing about a composable CDP is it's composable, meaning all the different elements of what a traditional CDP can do can be gravitated towards the different parts of the stack that matter. So if you really like Braze's audience tool, you can use that. If you love Hightouch and you want to send all your data from your warehouse and it's a kind of complex model, you don't have to change your warehouse structure. You can just do it. So folks like Segment and others, they are still trapped in that 3-object system of groups, accounts, or users, and events. And so if you have a complex business with multiple objects, a traditional CDP just might not work for you. The second thing real quick is because that data is stored in the actual third party, that means inherently if you use a traditional CDP, you're going to be paying more than if you used a composable CDP.
I think you just hit on 2 really good points. If you're using a CDP, you have some sort of redundancy in your stack, because a lot of times you're processing that same data and storing it twice already. One of the things I see all the time is with some of our customers is they do have a lot of complex entities and related models, whether it be something like products, playlists, workspaces. All of this is really hard to conform in a traditional CDP. And that's not even accounting for data science models and for things like propensity and LTV, which is very difficult to calculate in a CDP, because a lot of times you are solely regulated to that clickstream and event data, and you don't have a lot of those first party attributes you need, which really only live in the warehouse. So you're kind of one of the pioneers in the composable space. You, from what I've heard, have been actually building out a composable CDP. So I'm curious, why did you decide to go with this warehouse-centric approach over a traditional CDP? And I think your answer will be a lot more interesting than most, given that you actually worked at mParticle. So you've seen behind the scenes architecturally into both.
Yeah. So the first thing is, I would say a big difference between Ramp and a lot of the customers that I worked with previously is that Ramp is a B2B business and mParticle is built and designed for B2C businesses. So that's a big difference that can't be ignored. And Hightouch actually was just starting to be integrated when I joined. And so I wasn't necessarily the pioneer at Ramp, but I had used Hightouch actually 1.5 years before, when Tejas was just starting. And my thought was the best thing about it is that, again, you can break up the capabilities of a CDP into component parts, meaning that you actually have the flexibility to do things better than with a traditional CDP. Because the way that it worked before, if you go back to 2018, 2019, you have a stack where all your ingestion occurs at the CDP layer, your audiences occur in the CDP, and then you federate data out to different tools. And one of those destinations would be a warehouse. So it creates kind of the CDP as the nucleus or the center of your technology universe. The problem, though, is all this data lives offline in the warehouse. And at the time, it wasn't possible to move data from the warehouse back in its CDP, but it created lots of cyclical challenges. One is, who's responsible from a management perspective in doing that modeling? How easy is it to model? This was before dbt existed. How easy is it to manage that model and stream that data back to the warehouse? The warehouse didn't have a reverse ETL, so it actually wasn't easy to get data back into the CDP. You'd have to actually create some type of script to run it against like an endpoint to accept that data back in the CDP. Once it's accepted in the CDP, by default, all that data is going to federate to all your downstream tools. So do you have the rules and regulations in place to only send that data to a small variety of vendors? A couple of years ago, that was not a well understood or kind of well managed set of solution spaces. Most people were using CDPs for a very basic premise. They were trying to collect data and federate it to tools. But I think like the evolution of businesses is that they've now graduated past that norm and they really want to do more. They want to be able to enrich their data. Enrichment is a common practice now amongst most kind of like, digital friendly, digital native businesses. And so the status quo has now shifted from, hey, it's not good enough just to be able to send my data to downstream vendors. I actually need to do a lot more with it. And I have the capabilities to do that. Tools like Snowflake now exist. Tools like dbt now exist. Data engineering is a lot easier to do. So you have companies now being more resourced because it's easier to actually manage that solution set. And I think what that's done is it's meant that like now that things are easier to do in the warehouse, we can do more with a lot less. And so that's what's necessitated this need to how do we unlock the warehouse as a source of truth and a source for driving value to the business. And, as it relates to Ramp, I would say, we've always been a third-party friendly environment. We treat our vendors as our learning partners. It's a great playground for us to learn and grow. So we always try to get as far as we can with vendors before buying or before building. I know a lot of teams out there, have these discussions around build versus buy, but we're a big believer in build and buy. So build the stuff that is really essential and core to the business. Buy the stuff that's not. If you outgrow or outpace the stuff that you've bought, then you can build it. And I would say that's like a big part of our mentality around velocity in the engineering team is that we we don't have a problem using tools to get stuff done. And Hightouch represents one of those areas where, why would you go to the trouble of building 100 different integrations when you can literally just create a model in dbt, sync it to Hightouch, federate it to any destination you want. The WYSIWYG editor is so easy that even somebody with very little programming experience can do it. And I think that's really the power of the composable CDP space as a whole, is that we've taken these really complex actions that before required a lot of energy and data and engineering resources. And now, for example, at Ramp, me and my counterpart, Eric Albanese, we're managing 20 different syncs to a bunch of ad networks. So you have two people with like low to advanced levels of engineering experience doing a lot. I think that speaks more to the power of the composable CDP is not that necessarily it's, 1,000 times better than any other way you could do it. It's just that you can be a lot more powerful with less. And I think that's what businesses are looking for, especially in the context of today's environment.
Doing more with less. I love that. And I want to touch back on like the build aspect. It's not that you're necessarily building every component of the composable CDP, but it's more like you can purchase a tool and then assemble it. So I almost think assemble is a better word because what you get with that is interchangeability like later on. Maybe you don't like your event collection and you want to swap that out. But because it's all built around the warehouse, you own the underlying data infrastructure at the end of the day.
Yeah, and people get really fixated on this concept too of redundancy. And I think there's two types of redundancy. There's like good redundancy and bad redundancy. Good redundancy is when you have an overlapping set of solutions, but it provides ultimately good value to the business. Mm-hmm. For example, audiences, I think, is an example of good redundancy. We have multiple tools at Ramp where we can create audiences. I don't think that's a bad thing. It only becomes a bad thing when people are creating tools in every single one of those and they're no longer consolidated. But I think from a technology strategy perspective, having multiple tools is a good thing because you never know what context or use case is going to come along where whatever you're trying to do is maybe not supported. And you want to have the flexibility to unlock whatever you're needing to do quickly. Bad redundancy, in my opinion, is like where you have two vendors doing the exact same thing. So we got into this a lot early on at Branch, where people would be using Branch for deep linking and AppsFlyer for attribution. And it's like at the end of the day, they're both actually the same tools and they should be doing the same thing. And so I think it takes a particular eye towards like, is this an area or category that needs to be consolidated, or is this an area category where having multiple versions of a tool can be useful in the long run? And what I would say is if you do go that route of having multiple overlapping tool sets, again, a conscious and thoughtful strategy for how you use tools is so important. We talked about this earlier as one of the pain points is like, do we send or federate data from Hightouch, or do we use, I don't know, HubSpot to send this one-off integration data somewhere else? It doesn't actually matter so long as you and your team have developed a strategy that's cohesive and thoughtful so that you're not actually duplicating data in lots of different places and causing pain and confusion.
So you touched on, like, at Ramp right now, you're sending a lot of data to various ad platforms. How do you quantify the value of the composable CDP architecture, whether that be in terms of engineering resources or in terms of the actual outcomes you're driving?
When I think about like quantifying value, I think what a lot of people want to do is create a business case where they say like, this tool drove X revenue. Being able to describe the tool value in terms of revenue generation is always good, right? Because it just means that you can grow your business as long as the other business is growing. With infrastructure tools in particular, though, I think it actually is more about like, what would this cost us to build and manage ourselves? And what value are we getting out of being able to deploy those resources otherwise? And so one way to look at the composable CDP space is, again, there's three capabilities. There's identifying and collecting events, there's creating audiences, and there's federating data. Let's start with federating data because it's really easy. You know, like how long would it take an engineer to build a single integration pipeline? How long would it be for that engineer to have to manage it? How many hours per week? What happens if the API updated from that vendor? Now multiply that over all the number of vendors that you have, and you'll find very quickly that it's actually like, it's not that a single integration costs a lot of money. It's that doing 20 integrations all at once is not feasible. So if you're starting a business and you need to go from 0 to 1 quickly, there is no better solution than using a third party to send data to integrations, because you would never be able to build as many integrations as quickly and maintain them. So that's an example where quantifying value is really easy. For audiences, it's somewhat of the same thing. You have to ask yourself the question, every single audience integration is usually distinct and different from those data integrations where you're just sending third-party events. So how complex would it be for me to actually have to build this integration? And also how complex would it be for me to have to like build the actual audience creator itself? You know, because it's not just about building the integration to send the list of users out to Meta. It's also about the WYSIWYG editor to allow the marketer to actually create that in a way that makes sense. And that could be like a whole production cycle. You know, you could have an engineer staff for 6 months building an audience creator. So again, I think like the value is really easy to determine in terms of like raw engineering effort, and should persuade people that the better solution is just to pursue third-party integrations and third-party vendors. But that's typically how I think about the space.
Yeah. So I know I want to hark back to something you said earlier, specifically about reverse ETL and composable CDP. Why would someone choose a traditional CDP still if you have event collection built into the warehouse?
I think in my mind, what it really comes down to is what are the problems the customer is actually solving for? Mm-hmm. You know, traditional CDPs and even what I would call like all-in-one CDPs, which that's not like the mParticle and segments of the world. There's a variety of what I would consider CDPs that are all-in-one, that market themselves as CDPs, but when you go on their website, you basically find a login screen and no public documentation. And I think each of those categories is solving for a very different customer audience. You know, folks like Treasure Data are solving for the CMO suite who's trying to solve a problem, a pain. You know, organizationally speaking, we don't have the ability to collect our audiences and consolidate user profiles in a way that we can use to gratify our business. And what we're really looking for is more of like a business outcome. And the solution set that they provide is often much more customized, professional services based, because they're customizing the solution to exactly what that CMO or C-level executive wants. Traditional CDPs are kind of like the golden standard for a lot of engineering and growth leaders who have grown up in the last 5 years doing things the exact same way. And so I'd say like there's a lot of familiarity to it, right? And predictability. And I would say composable CDPs, again, are on the leading edge of what's possible, but there is a certain requirement. If you're going to be building all of your data out of the warehouse, one, you have to have a warehouse first strategy. And two, you have to have warehouse experts. You have to have people who understand and want to build out of the warehouse. I think a lot of businesses aspire to use tools like Hightouch, but don't have the internal capabilities and resources to do it. And so that would be an instance where perhaps maybe a traditional CDP or one of these all-in-one CDPs is actually going to be a best fit for them. But, back to my main point, I do think all businesses in the long arc of things want to be more digitally native, are investing in the warehouse, are trying to become more technologically savvy. And so in the long arc of things, I think they kind of graduate towards the composable CDP. But that doesn't mean that the whole industry is going to move all at once. It's going to take time.
Yeah, I think the best example of that is Snowflakes and Databricks. People still moving off of legacy data warehouses like Netezza. It's still very, very, very common, but everyone wants to be in that cloud native world. What do you tell people who they want to set up a composable CDP, but they're struggling to get that buy-in, or they don't have the resources? Where do they start?
I mean, I would say the journey to a composable CDP starts internally, right? Like if you are really interested in the flexibility that a composable CDP affords, you got to partner with your engineering and data folks. And that's one of the things that I love so much about the space is it's bringing together product, data, engineering, and marketing in a way that really has never happened before. Mm-hmm. Often, even with a traditional CDP, it would be like, hey, marketing is going to buy this tool and engineering is going to implement it. But, it wasn't a shared tool. And I think what's interesting about composable CDPs is because it lives across the stack, there's a level of teamwork and camaraderie that is forced upon your organization. And so I would say, and I've had these conversations with a lot of consultant offerings recently where people are trying to move to this new world with the composable CDP, and all the roads lead to the head of data or to the head of engineering to say, like, are you aware of this tool set? Are you aware of like how you could actually help us and get more value? Because ultimately the cool thing about a composable CDP is it gives you all like the strength and outcomes that marketing wants, and still gives you the control that engineering and data teams want. And I don't think like in some traditional or even all-in-one CDP solutions that exists from an experience perspective.
Yeah, and I think thinking in terms of outcomes rather than the actual components of a CDP is probably a good way to do it too, because a lot of marketers today, it's like CDPs were the only solution, and the only solution is the best solution, but that's not the case anymore with warehouses.
People just want turnkey solutions, right? Because I think we're creatures of habit, and so we reach for things that are familiar. But I think a really cool and perhaps newfound discovery with composable CDP is that there's lots of versions of great that you can create. And that is what's very different from the last few years, is that there's not necessarily a tried and true single standard way to build a stack. There's many different versions of how you can build it with a composable CDP. And so I think people want to hear that, because that means that wherever you're starting, you can actually make something great out of it.
And I think the beauty of the composable CDP too, it doesn't have to be like all of the layers of a composable CDP. It could just be event collection. It could just be identity resolution, or it could just be the activation layer. I think the important thing to remember is you don't have to solve for everything at once. Like you can tackle each one a little bit at a time. We've talked a lot about data. I'm curious, what would you be doing if you weren't working in the data space today?
It's a great question. Yeah, because there's so many of us startup operators who haven't quite yet hit our jackpots. But what would we do when we do? So I'm a water skier. I love being out in the water. So I'd probably try to be an amateur and water ski every day. I'm a dad dog, so I'd probably just own more dogs. I think it would also be really cool to like own a restaurant or cafe of some sort, just because I feel like so much of my life and my career has been built digitally. It would be great to work in the real world with your physical hands, and where your product is something that you can touch and feel. So yeah, if I wasn't working in data and marketing technology, I'd probably be like a part-time cafe owner on a water skiing lake.
So what's your go-to de-stress or escape from technology? For me, it's just being out in nature, not looking at a screen or blue light.
Oh, the thing for me, which is very, it's unextraordinary, but like obviously exercise is the number one thing. Everybody has their own version of exercise, but for me, it's about training. I've really found as I've gotten older, it's not just enough to go out for a run, but having a goal that I'm working towards and trying to be better is really what drives me to have like pleasure and de-stress outside of the work environment. And so as an example, like I was training for a triathlon from January to April. And, some people are very competitive and have like goals and times to hit. for me, the goal was just do it, like get out there and compete, because competing is such a thrilling experience. It doesn't really matter whether you win or what the time is. It's just the rush of feeling like you're part of something. And so I always try now. I've been trying for the last couple of months to have something I'm training for. And I tend to treat my workout times each day as like a non-negotiable and somewhat sacred part of my life, just because it helps me sleep better. It's de-stressing. You obviously can eat anything you want if you work out more, or mostly you can eat anything you want if you work out more. And it provides the consistency in your life when everything else seems to be chaotic, especially if you're traveling or whatever for work. It's just something you can do from almost anywhere.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Is there anything you want to call out or touch upon before we end this?
Yeah, I guess like two closing thoughts. First is thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure. I'd say for all the folks listening in, the mantra that I always say is like tools are just meant to solve problems. And so, like if you're pursuing tools for another reason than that, then you should kind of like take a step back and reevaluate your approach. And the second thing I would say is, if you like this conversation and this topic category was really interesting, I do have a Reforge course landing in the fall. I think it's October 1st is when it's coming out. And me and Jan and Lord are going to be leading it together in October. And we go pretty deep into topics just like this. Some other topics that are really interesting is around organizational design, how to audit your technology stack, like what are the factors or characterizations of a good stack versus a bad one. So if you're a Hightouch customer or user, or if you just love this type of conversation, I would say definitely check out the course.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we'll put that in the description down below. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Austin. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Luke.